Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics and Westminster, where today David Cameron is completing his final day at number 10. He's been meeting his cabinet for the last time, while Theresa May prepares to take over as Prime Minister after a dramatic end to the Conservative Party leadership election. Theresa May says she's honoured and humbled to be chosen to lead the nation, and she's pledged to make a success of the UK's exit from the EU. But who will get the top jobs in her government, and what will be her priorities? David Cameron is packing his bags at Downing Street months earlier than expected. We'll be discussing the legacy of his time in office and asking, will it be defined by his decision to call the EU referendum?
With the Conservatives' leadership election now over, Labour's is about to get going. I'm here at the party's HQ ahead of a crunch meeting that could determine Jeremy Corbyn's fate.
Some parties are calling for a general election now, but will Theresa May wait until 2020? We find out if the public is ready to go back to the polls. All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today, it's the Church of England priest and commentator Giles Fraser. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So where else can we begin, other than with the news that Theresa May is to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? Her rise to the top job, which is due to formally take place tomorrow, was triggered by David Cameron's failure to win the EU referendum. And she was helped along the way by her Brexit-supporting rivals falling aside. This morning, Theresa May attended David Cameron's last cabinet at Downing Street and will now be working on her first speech as Prime Minister and deciding who to appoint to her government. One of the biggest questions is who she'll appoint to the second most important job, that of Chancellor of the Exchequer, and how she will put together a cabinet that united those who supported a vote to leave and a vote to remain in the EU referendum. Giles Fraser, much has been made of the fact that she is Britain's second woman Prime Minister. And I suppose that is still a big deal.
It's a huge deal. But, I mean, it's one of the great things that's going on at the moment is that women seem to be taking over all around the world. And we can have a woman president of the United States, maybe, and we can have Angela Merkel and Scotland. I mean, we really are being run by women, and it's great. Great to have that broken, that male dominance broken. Really good.
Well, she's risen to the top. David Cameron, as we said, is packing his bags and leaving. It's hard to believe that he was elected with a Tory majority, the first since 1992, just last year. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, this morning I think, how do you do it so quickly? I want to know how you leave so quickly. I mean, the poor man 2 days ago was just sort of leisurely, just imagining he had a little bit to go, and now he has to get out, and I mean, we're going to have to just like pause and think about what his legacy is, because the Brexit thing may or may not dominate it.
Surely
but I think
won't it?
Well, but there may be other things too that we could think back on David Cameron's time, and we should really give him the benefit now of just like beginning to think a little bit more broadly about what he's done, the good things that he's done, and the things that he hasn't done so well. So
you wouldn't put it simply that you're pleased to see him go. You have got some sympathy for him.
Oh no, I'm pleased to see him go. I mean, I'm pleased to see the end of the sort of Bullingdon Club politics. I'm pleased to see the end of that sort of way of austerity that he represented. I wanted some more one-nation Tory, if we're going to have a Tory, and he was that to start with and ended up not being that. And I think Theresa May be that again. Well,
we will find out. Of course, in due course, we'll talk a bit more about David Cameron's legacy later on in the programme. Well, as we've been discussing, tomorrow will be David Cameron's final appearance at Prime Minister's Questions, after which he will visit the Queen to tender his resignation. Soon after that, Theresa May will make the same journey to Buckingham Palace before she heads to 10 Downing Street to take over as the second female Prime Minister in this country's history. So what's going to be high on her list of priorities? Theresa May's first task tomorrow evening will be to appoint people to the other great offices of state: Chancellor, Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary. Other senior ministerial appointments will likely trickle out on Thursday as the cabinet reshuffle continues. Although some are suggesting she should seek a mandate from the country, she has explicitly said there should be no general election until 2020. Having vowed that Brexit means Brexit, her first task will be to step up negotiations with other EU countries, which have, in some cases, already begun behind the scenes. She's previously said that Article 50, formally announcing the UK's intention to leave the bloc, will not be triggered until next year at the earliest. To assist in unravelling the UK-EU relationship, a new department for Brexit will be set up in Whitehall. The new Prime Minister's first big moment on the international stage will come at the G20 summit in September. But leaving the EU is not Theresa May's only focus. There's the vote on Trident renewal next Monday, the upcoming decision on whether or not to expand Heathrow, which she is thought to oppose, and a platform of social and economic reform outlined in her leadership speech this week. Well, yesterday, Theresa May gave a statement setting out the principles that will guide her as Prime Minister.
Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it. Second, we need to unite our country. And third, we need a strong, new, positive vision for the future of our country. A vision of a country that works not for the privileged few, but that works for every one of us. Because we're going to give people more control over their lives. And that's how, together, we will build a better Britain. Thank you.
Well, let's talk more about Theresa May's rise to the top with the historian Vernon Bogdanor and the Conservative Damien Green, a friend of Mrs May's since university. Welcome to both of you. But first of all, Vernon Bogdanor, just a sense of the occasion in terms of the history of a new Prime Minister, a woman Prime Minister, coming halfway through, or certainly in the beginning, actually, of a new Parliament.
Yes, there's no requirement, of course, to have a general election with a new Prime Minister, though, of course, the character of a government is very often determined by the Prime Minister. And many thought that when Gordon Brown succeeded Blair in 2007, I beg your pardon, he ought to have had an election. The last new Prime Minister who did have an election, you have to go right back to 1955, when Anthony Eden, who'd been Prime Minister for about 3 weeks, called an election and was rewarded with an increased majority. The situation this time, though, is rather different because the House of Commons that was elected last year, that is sustaining Theresa May, has been shown to be quite unrepresentative of the British public. So, although there's no constitutional requirement for an election, there is, in a sense, a democratic requirement for an election. And that's a problem that Theresa May face, given that she was a Remain supporter.
Right, and we'll come back to this in just a moment because we can talk to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who is outside Number 10 and has been there, I think, most of the morning, witnessed certainly the arrivals and departures of David Cameron's final cabinet.
There were a few little cameos, I suppose, here in the street. I thought the most sort of interesting one was Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary. Who knows, he could be becoming Chancellor soon, but when he left and he was asked, well, how did it go? And he went like this, so. And I think what he meant by that was, obviously, it was quite a poignant moment, because here you have the Prime Minister, in effect, having to say his farewells when only a year ago he sort of dragged his party from the clutches of a hung Parliament into government. So obviously a poignant moment. Nicky Morgan, when she came out, said there'd been lots of, quotes, lovely tributes to Mr Cameron. Theresa May, when she came out, there was quite a nice little vignette. She came out and then she kind of strode in that direction, but she was going to the wrong ministerial car, had to turn around and head in that direction to go in the right ministerial car. So I think people will be hoping she's a bit more decisive when she's in government. But she did it quite nicely for the camera. She did a kind of silly me moment on the steps of Downing Street. So I think that'll probably be on the front of most of the papers tomorrow morning.
Yes, well, old habits die hard, don't they? It has been quite quick, the speed of transition, it seems. Also, we were told the removal men had arrived. I'm not sure we had a shot of it, but as you say, it's happening so quickly, this handover.
It is. The removal van is just parked the other side, and all the snappers have got their long telephoto lenses, presumably to try and catch a couple of men in overalls carting a sofa out or something. But it is so brutal, and it is happening so fast. So Theresa May now has to slam together her government remarkably quickly. And I suppose the difficulty for her is this is such a fundamental decision for her, the people she has around her, the message she sends out, but she's got to do it incredibly quickly. The only plus side, it seems to me, from the fact that she doesn't have to go through this protracted leadership contest is she has at least got some breathing space now to work out how she's going to approach these Brexit negotiations. She's got 2 months, a bit more than that, before the negotiations really get underway in the autumn. So on the one hand, the fact everything's happening terribly quickly is huge pressure in that she's got to appoint people very, very quickly. But on the other hand, it does give her that critical breathing space to think about how she's going to address Brexit, which, let's be honest, is probably going to define her premiership. Because although she said the other day about how she wants to set out her own agenda, you can't help feeling that make or break for her premiership is going to be Brexit.
Norman Smith, outside number 10. Thank you very much. Damien Green, the make or break will be the cabinet. Who should she appoint to those top jobs?
Well, she will want to find a balance. Clearly, she's already said that she's setting up this new department to negotiate the exit terms, and that will be led by someone who voted to leave, and she said Brexit will mean Brexit, so that clearly will be one of the key appointments. But otherwise, I mean, frankly, like any incoming Prime Minister, I'm sure she'll want to create a balance across the party of types of personalities, regional backgrounds, all that kind of thing.
But will it be, will the onus be on her to put a lever in the position of Chancellor, for example, because Philip Hammond has been talked about as a possible contender for that role. He was a Remainer, even if people thought he was a sceptical Remainer. Do you think that would be acceptable to the party?
Well, I think the party will want a government that can clearly take up the reins quickly and show a continuing competence. Clearly, the whole Brexit negotiations is going to be one of the most important things of the next few years, but it's not the only thing. And so, for Chancellor of the Exchequer, for example, clearly what you want is a degree of economic competence in a time where the global economy seems to be slowing down.
Right. I mean, in terms of the critical importance of who will be in that cabinet, you said just before we went to Norman Smith that it will be critically important that she marks her credentials in terms of leaving the EU. What does she have to do?
Well, I think the referendum has shown that what happens outside Parliament is now becoming much more important than what happens inside Parliament or the Cabinet. So I think she has to reassure the country that the decision taken by the public, which I think is not just a decision to leave the European Union, but a decision to control immigration from the European Union, she has to show that that decision will be carried out, and perhaps more generally that the views of people in the public who seem sometimes not to be listened to, that their views are taken into account. I think there's a huge gap, not so much between the political parties, but between the political class in general and the public, and that was shown by the referendum.
Right, and you're nodding. This is about the disconnect that clearly was demonstrated during the referendum. How could she do that? How can she actually reconnect?
Not just about the disconnect, it's also about the fact that we are a divided country, and we've been revealed as a country with huge and deep divisions. For me, there were those who are the beneficiaries of globalisation and those who are left behind by globalisation. So there's a huge task for a one nation, Tory particularly, to do exactly that, to try and bring everybody together, and not so people in parts of the country where they feel profoundly unattended to be listened to and take notice of.
She was seen, certainly by Liberal Democrats in the coalition time, as hardline on immigration. But she used a phrase in the contest saying she would have control of free movement. Now, you could argue either have control and control borders, or you have free movement. You can't have both.
Well, I agree with Vernon that one of the clear messages from the referendum is that the old system of free movement that we had from the rest of the European Union can't carry on. Clearly, there needs to be a big enough change that people will notice some change. There will need to be.
But there could be some still freedom of movement.
Well, I mean, we're now getting into semantics. You don't want to close the borders. You don't want to become North Korea. We will want skilled workers coming from Europe as we do from the rest of the world. And getting the balance right is clearly the key, while preserving as many of the economic advantages of our access to the single market as we can. That will be the nub of the negotiations, and where you land on that spectrum will be hugely important to our future prosperity.
Right, coming from somewhere like the Home Office, where she has been there an awfully long time, I think the longest Home Secretary. Not many people have made that leap, have they, from Home Secretary to Prime Minister?
I think the last one was Winston Churchill, though he had a number of intermediate posts on the way. But as you imply, it's an extraordinarily difficult department to run, probably the most difficult in Whitehall, and she's avoided all the snares in that department, which is a very creditable achievement. She's proved very strong executive ability, and she hasn't been frightened to take on important pressure groups such as the police. And she's dealt very firmly, I believe, with the issue of police corruption.
Right, what about then setting out when she's going to invoke Article 50? That will be what a lot of the pro-Brexit Leave Tory MPs will want to hear, and they'll want to hear it soon.
Just one point. I hate to take on a distinguished historian. Wasn't Jim Callaghan Home Secretary before he became Prime
You're
Minister?
absolutely right, and I plead guilty.
Good for you, I wasn't going to, but yes, good for you. Anyway, yes, on that issue, though, of Article 50, when does she need to say she's going to invoke it?
What she said is extremely sensible, which is that Britain needs to know what its negotiating stance is first. There's no point invoking Article 50, which then sets this 2-year deadline, before you've got your own ducks in a row. So Theresa suggested in one of the speeches she made when she launched her leadership campaign that she thought the end of the year, beginning of next year would be about the right time. So we've got the autumn internally to decide what are the most important things for us in the negotiation, rather than start a negotiation where you don't know what your negotiating stance is.
Do you think that will be quick enough for people who wanted the UK to leave the EU, that negotiations don't start immediately?
Doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, whether it is quick enough or not. I mean, I don't think we are going to have another general election. I mean, I think there will always be those who think Article 50 should be invoked immediately, but actually a sensible way of doing things is actually to get all your ducks in a row and just to prepare for what you're going to do. I mean, Theresa May has to assure people that actually Brexit means Brexit. That's what she's going to do, and she's done exactly that. So those of us who are enthusiastic leavers will be reassured that that's where she's going. But I think now she has a bit of time to do it properly, and I think that's OK.
Right, and it isn't just about Brexit, as you said. I mean, obviously, there is other things that she will want to do, and there is the rest of government to actually deal with, and we mentioned Trident there at the beginning. But some of the things that she's already mentioned, and she said that the Conservative Party must be completely at the service of working people, putting workers on boards, capping executive pay. Sounds like Ed Miliband's Labour manifesto.
Well, there was a small overlap, but clearly...
Well, no, it was quite a big part of what he was saying at the time.
I think one of the differences between Theresa May and Ed Miliband is that she gets things done. I mean, she's shown that as Home Secretary, that when she says she's going to do something, it happens, and that, I think, was the fear a lot of people had about Ed Miliband. But I do think yesterday's speech, it feels like about 3 weeks ago, but actually it was only yesterday morning she was making that speech.
I know, well, so much has happened since then.
That was a very interesting modernisation of the Conservative One Nation agenda, actually talking about the problems, and we've talked about it already, the disconnect a lot of people feel from the prosperity that some are having, actually dealing with one of those things, which are the some excesses of boardroom pay in some companies. Actually doing something about that is an important part of a message of pulling the country together again.
But what about her economic pitch? That seems to be differing as well from David Cameron and George Osborne, obviously dumping the idea of a surplus, reaching a surplus by 2020, less austerity. Do you agree with that too?
I do. I think it's realistic, given that, regardless of the economic effects on us of the Brexit
So you didn't
vote,
believe the manifesto you were elected on?
No, I believed it then, but what's happened since then is that the world economy has slowed down, and any sensible chancellor reacts to changing circumstances. As Keynes famously said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? The facts are changing in the world economy, so giving yourself some leeway on getting a deficit down to zero seems to me perfectly sensible. Indeed, George Osborne adopted that policy as well.
Right. So, are you waiting by your phone for a job offer?
Well, I can do the maths. There were, even on the first ballot, there were something like 160 odd people who voted for Theresa, and there are far fewer jobs than that in government. So I'm sure the whole of the Palace of Westminster is deeply tense at the moment, but a lot of people are always disappointed at these times.
But you're hopeful.
I'm an eternal optimist, but I'm also a realist, and I've been around long enough to know that one should go through politics with a wary eye.
You would?
I would, yes.
Yes. Well, you were close to Theresa May, and still are, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you both, gentlemen. Now, it's time for our daily quiz. David Cameron appeared to forget he still had a microphone on. Oh, no. After delivering a brief statement outside Number 10 yesterday. He won't be the first or last politician to do that. The question for today is, what did he do as he walked back inside? Was it A, mutter, "Caribbean, here we come"? B, hum a merry tune? C, high-five the policeman? Or D, ask Sam to open a bottle of something cold? And at the end of the show, Giles will give us the correct answer. Now, until the surprise announcement that Theresa May was to be elected as Conservative leader unopposed, David Cameron had expected to stand down as Prime Minister in early September, finishing his term in office with a final meeting of the G20 group of nations in China. He had hoped, of course, to see out his third term before handing over to his successor. But the failure of his campaign to remain in the EU made that impossible. Let's have a listen to him speaking yesterday.
I'm delighted that we're not going to have a prolonged Conservative leadership election campaign. I think Andrea Leadsom has made absolutely the right decision to stand aside, and it's clear Theresa May has the overwhelming support of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. I'm also delighted that Theresa May will be the next Prime Minister. She is strong, she is competent, she's more than able to provide the leadership that our country is going to need in the years ahead, and she will have my full support. Obviously, with these changes, we now don't need to have a prolonged period of transition. And so tomorrow I will chair my last cabinet meeting. On Wednesday, I would attend the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions. And then after that, I expect to go to the Palace and offer my resignation. So we'll have a new Prime Minister in that building behind me by Wednesday evening. Thank you very much.
To discuss David Cameron and his legacy, we're joined by Sam Gyimah. He's a Conservative minister and served as Mr Cameron's principal private secretary, and by the journalist Tim Montgomery. Welcome to both of you. Sam Gyimah, he'll only be remembered for one thing, and that's Europe and failing to keep Britain in the EU, which is what he campaigned for.
I think that's incredibly unfair. Obviously, it's down to historians to dissect everything that happened. But I think there are two big things about David Cameron's leadership. Firstly, we forget when David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party how unpopular the party had become. You know, in 1997, we were decimated in that election by Tony Blair. David Cameron became Prime Minister and led the party into government for the first time in 18 years, and then a majority Conservative government for the first time in 23 years. What for me was remarkable about that particular achievement is that he did that by also changing the party. In government, I think he's also achieved a lot. Again, he wanted to be the Prime Minister who was all about sunlit uplands, but ended up being the Prime Minister who had to perform an economic rescue mission. It's still in progress, but I think he did a great job on that. And that,
I mean, is it true to say that actually some of the good things that Sam Gyimah thinks he actually did will just be wiped out by the memory of Brexit and the EU referendum?
I'm afraid so, and he did do good things. I think hitting the 0.7% target on foreign aid, for example, same-sex marriage, those were real achievements. But of course he will be remembered for the European referendum defeat, which I welcome the result, but that will define how he's seen. And I think he should also be remembered for some of the things that he said he would do in government, like eliminate the deficit. Well, we're only halfway there to that, and we have a misshapen state as well. He said that he would control immigration, and he certainly hasn't done that. There have been really important things like schools reform and welfare reform, but if you evaluate him on the principal economic mission that he himself said was the Conservative Party's to achieve and deliver, he's way off target.
I think when you have more people in work than ever before in our country today, it didn't happen by accident. It happened because He and George Osborne had an economic plan that has delivered. It is still work in progress, but let's not forget that we had one of the worst recessions in the world. We had the biggest banking bailout in the world, so maybe we're over-optimistic in terms of how quickly it could be turned around.
But they did fail in their main mission to actually eliminate the deficit, didn't they?
Not at all. I mean, we stood on an election platform last year that we were going to be doing it by the end of this Parliament. So,
and now announced they won't even do it by the end of this Parliament. It's not just like sort of missed by a year or two. It's missed by a whole Parliament and more, Sam.
Wherever you stand on the Brexit debate, leave or remain, you've got to accept that we're now in a situation where there is serious economic uncertainty, and that means that the likelihood of meeting those targets at the end of this Parliament...
Are you saying it's only because of the Brexit vote that you're unlikely to meet those targets? Were you really going to hit, for instance, the surplus target that George Osborne had set, either whether we'd remained or left the EU?
I think there was a serious programme to deliver that in terms of welfare reform, in terms of public spending cuts, and there was a serious plan, and I'm confident.
Right. I mean, what do you think, though, broadly, in terms of coalition, dealing with the recession that Sam Gyimah talked about? Didn't David Cameron, to some extent, lead the country at least through that recession and out the other side?
I think one of David Cameron's definite achievements was to hold that coalition government together. I suspect when that coalition was formed at the beginning of the last Parliament, most pundits thought at some point it would collapse during those 5 years. And it's a huge tribute to Nick Clegg and David Cameron that they made it work. I think it's also significant, though, and of course this is why Ian Duncan Smith resigned a few months ago. Once the Liberal Democrats were no longer holding George Osborne and David Cameron back, you saw cuts in the budget that much more affected the poor, so that the rich were getting tax cuts and the poor were still getting austerity. That didn't happen quite the same under the Liberal Democrats. And I think it's interesting that Theresa May, in her speech yesterday, repudiated a lot of George Osborne's economic policy and said there must be a much greater bias to the people at the bottom end of the income spectrum.
I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that having won a majority, the first one since 1992, David Cameron's leaving a year later, that under the coalition, somehow they managed better.
Well, he called a referendum. He recommended Remain.
Was that a mistake?
The country chose a different... No, I think we'd got to a place where there had to be a referendum on Europe. I think the settlement on Europe was just not acceptable. There had to be a referendum. He called it. He recommended Remain. The country voted the other way. I think the right course of action for him was to leave. But I'm a proud Conservative because we introduced the national living wage. And when Tim talks about affecting the poor, that national living wage is a huge achievement and one that many people never expected a Conservative government of all to introduce. And I think David Cameron, the reason why we can even talk about ourselves today as a one-nation government and not get laughed out of the room.
Is it one nation when the country is divided?
David Cameron achieved.
You should get laughed out of the room for that. I mean, there was a huge banking crisis in which the country was screwed over by the banks, and David Cameron and his government stood four square behind the banks when many parts of this country suffered. And actually, in the end, it was probably that did for him. That there are places like Sunderland and Hartlepool, these first places that we remember that came in with huge majorities for leave. These are people who are feeling completely angry and unattended to. And it is very, very in part, it's David Cameron's fault that that's happened.
Oh, come on, Giles. The deindustrialisation in the north and some of these problems are decades in the making. To somehow say today that because RBS was rescued and it had to be rescued is why we've had problems there. It's just simply untrue. But I think you are right to say the referendum has pointed to lots of parts of our country where there is a need to make sure that the country works for everyone.
And it was a rejection, wasn't it, of David Cameron wholesale, that Brexit vote, to some extent. Do you think it undermined his whole project?
I think if he'd been a popular Prime Minister who had the authority of someone who people felt was governing for the whole nation, he wouldn't have lost the referendum. The great opportunity for the Conservatives now is that we haven't just voted to leave the European Union, we voted for a reset of our politics. And I think that begins with a focus on the North. That's what we're talking about. The Northern Powerhouse was a great idea, but it had no money in it. And as Theresa May in her speech said yesterday, it was too focused on Manchester and the North West. Sunderland, Newcastle, plenty of other places in the North have been neglected as well. And so the idea that Stephen Crabb and Sajid Javid have put forward, that we borrow 100 billion targeted on infrastructure. I hope Theresa accepts that.
So why did he win then in 2015? If you say there was a rejection of him, if he was a popular Prime Minister...
He won with 36% of the vote.
The referendum was not a referendum on David Cameron.
You don't think it was?
The referendum was because a lot of people felt that they weren't being listened to, and they weren't being listened to, particularly by distant bureaucrats in Brussels, and specifically on issues like immigration. It wasn't a referendum on David Cameron as Prime Minister, who won a record and unexpected majority just a year ago.
I think he was also very lucky that in his opposition. I think that has to be said. I mean, the Labour Party, I mean, it's still going through its trials and tribulations, and he was very lucky in his opponents. If he'd had a more effective opposition, I think he'd been a completely different...
You could say that about all history. If something else had happened, something else had happened.
I mean, if we look at some of the things that you mentioned in terms of social reform, gay marriage, school reform, prison reform underway, maybe parts of the party didn't like everything, welfare reform, NHS reform, again, not everyone supported these things. He was trying to be a moderniser within the sort of Conservative Party, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, and at the beginning there was that famous cover of The Economist where you had David Cameron in a Mohican and Union Jack-style haircut. But there were reforms like the NHS reforms that weren't advertised. And I think perhaps if they'd been a bit more focused on those core objectives, like deficit reduction, they might have achieved more of what they needed to achieve. And they actually became a slightly distracted government in its early years.
Will MPs miss David Cameron personally, do you think?
I think so. I would miss him personally. I was his parliamentary private secretary.
Yep.
I didn't know him before I became an MP. I was appointed. I was in his inner circle and saw him working up close. I would miss him tremendously. But I think also there are a lot of Conservative MPs in the 2015 and in the 2010 intake in particular who know that they are in Parliament today because of David Cameron. Right. He delivered election success, and that is why they can be MPs representing their constituencies.
Because he wasn't seen as somebody who was that popular in the parliamentary party, in all sections of it, that there was a sort of distance and aloofness between himself and the party. You would know you were the conduit, or one of the conduits between the number 10 office and MPs. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I was very popular when I had that job.
I bet you were.
Still popular,
everyone wanted to talk to me. But I think during the coalition in particular, Number 10 had to make more of an effort to make sure that it was connected with the parliamentary party. Because what you had the quad, Nick Clegg, Danny Alexander, David Cameron, George Osborne, thrashing out ideas and then announcing them. And sometimes the parliamentary party felt disconnected from those. And I think there needed to be a doubling down to make sure that the parliamentary party was plugged into Downing Street.
There were a whole range of people, unfortunately. Graham Brady, Mark Field, David Davis. If you crossed David Cameron once, you were out. He was quite an unforgiving Prime Minister to his critics. Theresa May, I hope, won't repeat that mistake. The Tories only have a majority of 12 and need to get on and treat each other with a little bit more mutual respect and are not so high and mighty from Downing Street.
Well, let's see how that works out. Thank you both very much. So yesterday's remarkable sequence of events, which saw Theresa May installed as Prime Minister in waiting, was triggered by the withdrawal of Andrea Leadsom from the Conservative leadership contest. She said she didn't have enough support amongst MPs to head a stable government.
I have, however, concluded that the interests of our country are best served by the immediate appointment of a strong and well-supported Prime Minister. I am therefore withdrawing from the leadership election, and I wish Theresa May the very greatest success. I assure her of my full support.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's thought Mrs Leadsom withdrew in part because of the response to an interview she gave with The Times on Saturday, in which she said that having children meant she had a very real stake in the future of our country. This appeared to many as an attempt to turn her motherhood into an advantage over her childless rival, Mrs May. Well, the journalist who conducted that interview, Rachel Sylvester, writes today that Mrs Leadsom suffered from inexperience and naivety. And Rachel joins us now. Welcome to The Daily Politics. Do you agree that your Saturday interview with Andrea Leadsom killed off her leadership ambitions?
No, I'm a journalist. I don't kill off leadership ambitions. But what it did, I think, is it exposed flaws in her candidacy that were already there. I just asked the questions. It was the answers that did the damage. And I think a lot of her colleagues in the House of Commons were already worrying about her lack of experience. She'd only been a junior minister and tested in the sort of pressure of a leadership campaign. Her naivety and lack of experience showed quite quickly.
What was going through your mind when you asked those fairly open questions about motherhood when Andrea Leadsom made that incendiary remark about having children giving her a stake in the future of our country?
Well, actually, first of all, I asked what's the difference between you and Theresa May, which was meant to be a sort of very open-ended question for her to give her pitch, if you like. And she started by talking about economic competence. And then she said, I'm an optimist and I've got a large family, including her children. So I then remembered that during the EU referendum debates, she'd quite often spoken as a mum, if you remember. She said as
yes,
a mother,
she talked about
as a
it a lot.
mum, and it was her way of, in a way, it was very clearly part of her political identity. So it was a logical question to say, well, does motherhood inform your politics? And that was then the answer she gave.
And were you surprised?
I was actually a bit shocked, more on an emotional level, because I immediately thought, gosh, that's actually quite a hurtful thing to say for Theresa May. And I didn't sort of immediately think, oh, gosh, in political terms, that's incredibly damaging. I just thought about it rather more emotionally. So I was surprised. But then very quickly, the conversation moved on to other things. And, you know, we were talking about her policies on various other aspects of the contest. But obviously, that was the bit that stuck in my mind.
What about other reasons, if you like, the other reasons that she outlined when she stood on the doorstep yesterday and read that letter? Because you said she wasn't really prepared for the brutality of the campaign. Do you stand by that, that actually it is brutal? And perhaps, you know, somebody like her who isn't media trained in that sense is not going to survive?
Yeah, and it's not really just about being media trained. You know, as Eric Pickle said, you're going to have to go up against Vladimir Putin. She would have had to go into negotiations with some of the sort of most experienced negotiators around Europe, in you know, the sort of political poker players in the world. So it's not just about the media. It's about, you know, you need a resilience if you're going to be Prime Minister, and you need good judgment and character. It's not just about your policies.
What was your response when you heard that Andrea Leadsom was pulling out of the race yesterday?
Well, I was delighted because I'm glad she's not Prime Minister. Not that I think that would ever likely to happen. I mean, you know, your interview I thought was very, very significant. I mean, I think people felt that she weaponised motherhood in a way that was entirely unacceptable. And it showed her naivety. And then that naivety was, the problem was that also she bottled it on the top of being naive, and she revealed herself to have a bit of a glass jaw. So, you know, I'm really glad, politics aside, I'm glad that she's not in the race.
But her supporter yesterday on the programme, John Redwood, said that he admired the fact that she was unspun, optimistic and fresh. I mean, are we now in an era where you can't have that? Perhaps maybe for Leader of the Opposition, if they were in opposition, but certainly not to be Leader and then Prime Minister.
It depends what's unspun. So Ken Clarke speaks his mind, you know, even the other day when he was caught on mic unwittingly. And nobody minded it, but I think it depends. If the unspun reveals that actually you do think motherhood gives you an advantage, then that's off-putting to some people. And I think the other point you mentioned was that there were a majority of MPs were against her, and there was a danger of a sort of Jeremy Corbyn situation with this impasse between the parliamentary party and the party in the country if she'd been elected in that way.
What about the fact that now we have Theresa May as, or certainly becoming Prime Minister, all the Leave candidates who stood for the contest have fallen by the wayside, one way or another. And the new leader, sceptical she may be or may have been about being Remain, is the new leader without much effort. What does that say?
It is extraordinary, isn't it? You sort of feel, well, they led us to this situation, and then where are they? And I think the problem for Theresa May will be the constant calls of betrayal. If, you know, she says Brexit is Brexit, but Brexit actually can mean a million things. So if she negotiates some kind of deal which involves aspects of free movement remaining, immediately the Brexiteers, the pure Brexiteers, will get incredibly cross.
Right, why isn't there a Leave candidate still standing?
I mean, it wasn't... I mean, I voted Leave, but I didn't vote for any particular people. It wasn't a general election where you were voting for candidates with any sorts of policies. I was voting for something that's simply what it said on the paper. And I think it was rather important for me. It was rather important I was voting for something rather than for people, because a lot of the people that I was voting alongside, I didn't share much of their politics in other ways. So it was, and I think this has demonstrated the truth of that. We didn't vote for a set of people, a set of policies. We voted Leave or Remain.
Rachel Sylvester, thank you. So from a leadership contest which has moved at lightning speed to one which is travelling at little more than a snail's pace. It's been more than 2 weeks since Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn began to be hit by a wave of shadow cabinet resignations. And yesterday, a challenger in the shape of Angela Eagle finally emerged. But the fate of Mr Corbyn may hang on a meeting of Labour's ruling National Executive Committee. It meets in a few hours' time, and our reporter Mark Lebel is outside Labour headquarters and can tell us more. Mark, what's happening?
Well, Joe, not long to wait, because in an hour and a half, the 33-member Labour National Executive Committee are going to meet in Labour's headquarters behind me to determine primarily whether Jeremy Corbyn automatically gets on the leadership ballot, or whether he has to face and get nominations, I should say, from 51 MPs and MEPs, which many say he would struggle to get. They're also going to determine, now that a contest has been triggered by Angela Eagle, how long other candidates have to throw their hat in the ring, and also who will be voting in that contest. We had these registered supporters that were crucial to Jeremy Corbyn's victory last time round, people who just pay a one-off fee of £3. We're expecting that amount to possibly go up, and how long they have to register their support.
Right, no one wants to make predictions these days about anything, which I totally understand. But do you think he will be on that ballot?
Right, well, let's just explain what has to happen here. Normally, the ballot will be interpreted by Labour Party rules, but because it's such a divisive contest, as we've seen just this morning, from a brick going through Angela Eagle's constituency office window, from abuse on social media, Ian McNicol decided, the Labour Party General Secretary, decided to get legal advice. Now, his legal advice apparently says that Jeremy Corbyn automatically would not get on the ballot and would need those nominations, but we've seen contrary advice from the unions and from a member of the NEC, and they said they'd challenge it in court. So it's now down to an NEC decision. They have to sit down amongst the group and decide. Now, I've gone through all 33 members and what their public utterances have been over the last few days, and Jeremy Corbyn would have a majority of around 5. However, the problem is that one person can't turn up today, one person's going to be late for the meeting, and there's talk of a secret ballot, which would mean that some of the union-backed members might vote against how they publicly stated they would vote, which is for Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, Jeremy Corbyn's so rattled that he's coming down, cancelled a speech in Brighton, and is coming down to the meeting himself because he's a member and he has a vote about his own future too.
Right, well, Mark, it's agonising. Thank you very much. We're joined now by the former Shadow Education Secretary, Lucy Powell. She resigned 2 weeks ago and is calling for Mr Corbyn to stand down. So the NEC is meeting later on today, and they will decide whether Jeremy Corbyn is automatically on the ballot paper. Do you want to make a plea to them to ensure he isn't?
Well, look, I personally feel that we have nothing to fear about Jeremy being on the ballot paper, in the sense that I think that the support for him amongst the party membership is falling, and is falling very quickly indeed. If you look at the polling that's happening amongst party members, amongst trade union affiliates, what's coming up from the grassroots, and if I look at my own party, in my own constituency, I've had many, many emails and phone calls from people who voted for Jeremy last year, who now think that it is untenable that he can continue without the support of his parliamentary colleagues. However, what the NEC are deciding today is not a political decision, and it shouldn't be a political decision. It's about the rules of the Labour Party.
But they can be interpreted either way, so it will be a political decision.
Well, I don't think they can actually be interpreted either way.
Which way do you interpret
I think
them?
they are pretty clear. I mean, there are two things I would point you to. One is the rule itself, which says where there is no vacancy, nominations may be sought by potential challengers. In this case, any nomination must be supported by 20% of the parliamentary Labour
challengers.
Party.
They're not talking about the incumbent.
And then if you also look at the most recent rule changes that we made on the leadership contest, the Collins Review says, in recognition of the fact that the leader of the Labour Party has a special duty to head the parliamentary Labour Party in Westminster, MPs will retain the responsibility of deciding the final shortlist of candidates that will be put to the ballot.
Right.
So I think, you know, as I say, whilst I would be confident of any contest, I think that our forefathers and those that drew up our constitution, including many trade union leaders, would have never imagined a circumstance where a leader of the Labour Party was seeking to continue on the basis of having less than 20% support of his MPs. And so the NEC are today being asked to make an exceptional decision, a political decision, to put him on the ballot paper automatically.
Why should he be on that ballot paper automatically in this case, if those are the rules?
Well, let's not do that. I mean, we could either talk about the legal stuff, or we could come at it for a different angle, which is to say that if he's not on it, it will look like an enormous stitch-up to a lot of people. It will look like a stitch-up because there are a lot of people out there that want to vote for him, maybe the majority of Labour members that want to vote for him.
But actually Lucy Powell says that's diminishing.
Maybe. Well, OK, but let's test it. So then let's test it. So I think everybody should agree, if that's the case, then supporters of Jeremy, like myself, and if there is a vote and he loses, he loses. That's a way of actually uniting the party around a new candidate. If, however, you don't put him on the...
Well, it's not me.
If it's not you, plural, and I think the PLP has a responsibility here, if he's not on the ballot, there will be the most enormous crisis for the Labour Party.
Well, there is a crisis now, I think.
But it will be... The Labour Party might well split, because there will be people like me from the left of the party who would feel that basically they're not wanted in the party, that the socialist alternative is not really required, and actually we will feel unable to be continue to be a part of the Labour Party.
Is that a danger? Is that a risk you're willing to take?
Well, no. Look, it's not my. As I say, it's not my decision. And
well, you could come out and say, put him on the ballot paper.
I agree with your sentiment that this is much better resolved, in a different way. All I'm saying is that we've got to sort of take some of the heat out of this situation. The NEC, who are an elected body of the Labour Party, are there to uphold the rules. Now, they may well choose, and Jeremy has many more supporters on the NEC than he has people who don't support him. They may well choose to take a political decision, an exceptional decision, to automatically put him on the ballot paper. And I believe that in that contest, Jeremy is likely to lose in any case. But they are the rules, and they are clear.
You'd speak in favour of that, though, would you? You'd speak in favour of him being on the ballot for political reasons?
No, I think the NEC's job is to uphold the rules, and I do think the rules are very clear.
Would you be in favour of him being on there?
I would have nothing to fear about him being on the ballot paper, but I do feel that those who are out this morning bullying and kind of mob rule of, throwing bricks through people's windows, having demonstrations outside the NEC meeting against elected members of the NEC who are there to make a perfectly rational and judicial decision about the rules of the Labour Party, should be allowed to do that in their own way, and not have political interference from me or from Giles. Is it acceptable, that behaviour,
bricks or a brick, going through Angela Eagle's constituency? We've had MPs on here anecdotally talking about intimidation from Corbyn's supporters, talks of treachery and betrayal. And then Len McCluskey saying that actually, in his mind, Jeremy Corbyn has been dealt with by a lynch mob, that there's been bullying and bludgeoning. I mean, is that really the sort of arena?
Let's distinguish the two things. The brick is completely unacceptable. When it turns into any sort of physical violence, is entirely and utterly unacceptable. And I think I need to say that 3 or 4 times just to absolutely make that perfectly clear. But actually, demonstrations are not unacceptable. Making your views known are not unacceptable. Making your views known passionately is not unacceptable.
But what about, you say that there'll be a large section of the membership, perhaps the majority, that will be very, very unhappy, and it's difficult to quantify. But isn't it true that in order to lead a political party under the system that we have, you must have the confidence of a parliamentary party? You are a shadow government. Yep. The idea is that you are preparing for government. You're not leading a movement in that strict sense of the word. Isn't that how our parliamentary democracy works?
So maybe we're in a process of realignment, is that there's all sorts of problems about MPs and members and the people themselves that are out of whack with each other. And it could be that the Labour Party is itself heading for a split, where there are parts of the Labour Party that seem very, very close to what Theresa May was saying, workers on the boards and so forth. The whole idea that that's close to Ed Miliband is true. So there's a part of the Labour Party which will be more comfortable in the left of the Tory party, and they seem to be a long, long way away from socialism, as I understand it, as traditionally conceived. So I think that the Labour Party may well not hold together.
Look, that's not me, and that's not the vast majority of Labour MPs.
Do you think Labour will stick together? Do you think it will have to split?
I joined the Labour Party when I was 15 under Margaret Thatcher, because I lived in Manchester and I was at a comprehensive school, and I saw what happened to my country under Margaret Thatcher and to my friends who had no life chance at all. I'm not going anywhere. This is my Labour Party just as much as it is anybody else's. But I do think we have a tradition in our party which is clearly exemplified in the rules of the Labour Party, where you have to, as a leader, both lead the parliamentary party as well as the wider membership. And I think we can move forward from this with a candidate who holds true to those values of our socialist roots, while at the same time uniting both aspects of the party.
Just very briefly, you backing Angela Eagle, or would you prefer Owen Smith?
Well, personally, I think Owen would stand a better chance of beating Jeremy Corbyn. I think we need a generational shift. But Angela has shown herself to be gutsy and ballsy, and I will back whoever comes top of that.
Lucy Powell, thank you very much. There is a statement from Jeremy Corbyn on the subject of the brick that was thrown through the constituency office, I think, of Angela Eagle. It's extremely concerning that Angela Eagle has been the victim of a threatening act and that other MPs are receiving abuse and threats. As someone who has also received death threats this week and previously, I'm calling on all Labour Party members and supporters to act with calm and treat each other with respect and dignity, even where there is a disagreement. I utterly condemn any violence or threats which undermine the democracy within our party and have no place in our politics. Thank you. Now, does anybody fancy another general election? We had one only last May. You might remember the Conservatives won a surprise majority. But with a new Prime Minister set to be installed, there have been calls from opposition parties for Theresa May to go to the country. But how do the voting public feel about the idea of another election already? Here's Adam in the Mood Box.
Greetings from Croydon, where it stopped raining just long enough for us to ask the great British public when the next general election should be. Now or in 2020, as it says under the law.
They need to get the ball rolling for the Brexit first.
Get the ball rolling.
Yeah, the ball's rolling.
Actually, I think now.
OK, grab a ball. Andrea Leadsom has pulled out. So it's Theresa May now. Okay. She's going to be the next Prime Minister. Excited by that?
No.
Oh.
I think it would strengthen her hand if she did have a general election, yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Grab a ball and pop it in the box.
At the end of the day, they voted for a party, not one person, so whether it's Cameron leading it or May leading it, I don't think it matters.
I think it'd be best for the country to get it over and done with, have it now.
Do you think we've had enough voting this year already?
No, it's best for the country to do it now then.
Well, if the weather carries on like this during Theresa May's premiership, she'll have to wear much more sensible shoes, like these. There's a mum explaining to her son what's happening. He's living through a great moment in political history.
Oh, there.
Wait and see. We're getting a new Prime Minister. Should we have a new general election? Yeah. Why are you laughing?
I think they should wait because more people can then make up their minds.
Right.
And
give her a bit of time to have done something.
Yeah, exactly, because she hasn't really done a lot.
So put it in the 2020 box and I'll hold the pram. Do you think she should have a general election?
I think so, yes, because a lot of people in this country at the moment aren't happy with the whole Brexit scenario that happened.
Yeah, but they had a vote on that already.
They had a vote, but because it was so close, a lot of people felt that it was they wanted it to be a landslide decision.
Time for the big reveal under the Daily Politics umbrella. And look, a bulk of people in Croydon think there should be a general election now rather than 2020. Totally unscientific, of course. Now, where are those Daily Politics towels?
Oh, well, the weather was unkind, testing the political temperature there. Out with the voting public, Adam Fleming. Well, we're joined now by Lib Dem President Sal Brinton, who is calling for an early general election, and by the Conservative MP Charles Walker, who isn't, helpfully. So, Sal Brinton, it was Liberal Democrats who wanted the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Why have you changed your mind?
We haven't. There's provision within the Fixed Term Parliament Act to call an election, very, very clear criteria, 65% of MPs, or in the event of a vote of no confidence, and then 14 days. Because for exactly the reason that we're in that now, when there's a major change in the country, the referendum was the biggest decision this country's made in decades, and frankly also the Conservative manifesto that was voted on last year, most of that's gone out of the window. Stability has gone, Osborne's gone away from austerity, all of those reasons. A new Prime Minister needs a new mandate, not least for the plans for Brexit.
I mean, she needs a popular mandate.
Well, no.
She was a Remainer. The UK has voted to leave, and she's only been elected Prime Minister by your colleagues.
Well, I voted against the nonsense of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, both at second reading and third reading, and it was the Liberal Democrats that were fully behind it. But the truth is, we've had three changes of Prime Minister in my lifetime. We had Wilson Callaghan, we had Thatcher Major, and we had Blair Brown. All three of those parliaments ran for 5 years, so there's no constitutional precedent.
But as you remember,
for
Gordon Brown was always said to have regretted that decision, certainly of having marched everyone to the top of the hill and then not calling that election and having a popular mandate.
Yes, but it was Gordon Brown who was promoting an early general election. Theresa May isn't. She's talking about going to 2020.
Right. I mean, isn't that the case, that actually if she quells any talk of an early general election, then at least she will have settled the decision, Theresa May?
It will be interesting to see if she can do that. Your popular vote on the streets of Croydon was showing that actually there is quite a strong momentum at the moment, people saying, where are we standing at the moment? Where are we going to go? And let's not forget that in 2007 it was Theresa May who called for Gordon Brown to have an election because he had no mandate.
Right. I mean, is now the right time?
Absolutely not. I mean, Theresa May's got to get on and do stuff. I mean, I think the Liberal Democrats are just sore losers about the referendum, and they're just looking for a way to turn the clock back and try and wheedle their way out of a very clear decision that the country made. And so I think that basically we have to get on and do it. The country's spoken, and what Theresa May's big job is to implement what the will of the British people is.
We've had enough uncertainty, haven't we?
It isn't just the Liberal Democrats. Labour were calling for it earlier today as well, and it's all the big issues about...
I'm not sure about Labour. I'm not sure that Labour
universally, in his heart of hearts, or even his heart, wants a general election.
But
I think
some of your
colleagues...
The point, surely, is whether the new Prime Minister has a mandate, and we and many other politicians are concerned that she doesn't.
Has she got a mandate?
We don't directly elect Prime Ministers, we elect governments. This is, I mean, to be honest, this is why I voted against the nonsense of the Fixed Term Parliament Act when it was introduced into the House of Commons.
Are you regretting that Fixed Term Parliament Act?
Because this is sort of proven... The emergency provision is there for exactly this sort of situation where the country has made the biggest decision in decades. The landscape has changed.
Would it be better to wait until we have a clearer idea, at least, as to what the renegotiation will look like? So not now, but maybe in 18 months' time.
We are saying an election for a mandate. We aren't saying next week. But clearly, at the moment, we have a Prime Minister coming in tomorrow. There is no clear Brexit plan. And what's more, the economy has changed.
This is just shouting fire, fire. This is not an emergency situation. What we require is not people shouting fire. We require people having calm heads, getting on and implementing what the will of the British people was, and it's pretty clear.
Can you tell us what that is? Because
yes, to leave the European Union. It's absolutely very clear. It was there on the paper.
It's not that simple, and you know that. It's all the detail and how it affects
which is what has to be worked out.
Economy.
Would it strengthen her negotiating position in terms of Brexit by having an election?
She's not going to have a general election. To have a general election, she's got to persuade Conservative Party colleagues to have a vote of no confidence.
And you don't think they'll do that?
I mean, really, what a ridiculous confection that would be. She's just about to become Prime Minister tomorrow, and within a couple of weeks we have a vote of no confidence. I mean, people should have thought about this when they passed the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
All I would say is that over the last few weeks, things have changed so dramatically. Events, dear boy, events may well
There was only a general election last year.
There was, but things have changed really fundamentally, and there is no...
All right.
They have changed.
All right. Well, we are going to change Prime Minister, but thank you both for coming onto the programme. There's just time before we go to find out the answer to our quiz. Giles Fraser. David Cameron appeared to forget he still had a microphone on after delivering a statement in Downing Street yesterday. It's catching. The question was, what did he do as he walked back into number 10? Was it A, mutter, Caribbean, here we come? B, hum a merry tune, C, high-five the policeman, or D, ask Sam to open a bottle of something cold? That was probably a good idea anyway. So, Giles, what's the correct answer?
Well, I don't know, but it's got to be open something cold, hasn't it?
No, no, let's have a look. Right. Now, you may not recognise it, but he was humming a merry tune. Have you got any ideas what that tune may have been, Giles Fraser?
No, it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't the tune that you've got there. There's way too many notes in it.
It's absolutely true. But what do you think of him humming? He sounded very upbeat and sort of, I've got out.
Yes. He's going to be gung-ho, isn't he? He's going to enjoy himself. Well, go on then. He's going to the
He probably then opened a bottle of something
He probably
cold.
did.
Thank you to all of you, but thank you particularly to Giles Fraser for being my guest of the day. And the 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One now. And, of course, we'll be back for 11:30 tomorrow for the last Prime Minister's Questions for David Cameron. Bye.
We might find things here we don't like. They might be distasteful. They might be deeply troubling.